Hey, this video is part two of a two-part. Let's prepare for the remembrance. In part one, I was talking about how we prepare for the remembrance and get our heads in the right headspace. This part, I'm just going to be reading some verses around the first remembrance and some other thoughts about it. It's intended to listen to on a Sunday morning before you go to the remembrance to get your head in the right headspace. So you can listen to or read along or whatever you like. So let's get started. I'm going to be reading in Luke chapter 22 on the first remembrance here, also the Last Supper. So Luke 22, verse 7. The day came for the festival of thin bread, and it was time to kill the Passover lambs. So Jesus said to Peter and John, "Go prepare the Passover meal for us to eat." And they asked, "Where do you want us to prepare it?" Jesus said to them, "As you go in the city, you'll meet a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him into the house and say to the owner, 'Our teacher wants to know where he can eat the Passover meal with his disciples.' The owner will take you upstairs and show you a large room ready for you to use. Prepare the meal there." So Peter and John left. They found everything just as Jesus told them. They prepared the Passover meal. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the apostles with him. So the words are there to help our God-given imaginations picture this. Just take a moment to picture this large room as it's described. You know, the Passover was eaten at night, so I assume there would be lamps or candles around, like oil lamps. The table is very close to the floor, as is the Hebrew style. Plates would be made of stone or maybe pottery, and on them would be the flatbread of the Passover, and maybe some bean stew and some bits of lamb, some fish, as was the custom for the Passover at the time, and wine. So the place would smell of these foods. The bitter herbs that they ate, the place would smell of that. Try to imagine that. And the wine and the food. And the disciples are reclining around the table. And in John's gospel, it mentions the foot washing happening first. Now, Jesus knows he's about to enter the suffering. But before that, he wants to set up this ceremony for his disciples to remember him. So continuing in the book of Luke, Luke 22, when the time came for Jesus and the apostles to eat, he said to them, "I very much wanted to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer. I tell you, I won't eat another Passover meal until it's finally eaten in God's kingdom." Jesus took some of the bread in his hands, and he gave thanks for it. He broke the bread, and he handed it to his apostles. And then he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Eat this as a way of remembering me." And after the meal, he took another cup of wine in his hands, and he said, "This is my blood. It's poured out for you. And with it, God makes his new agreement." They take it, they share it. It's tough to know how long they took. You know, you can read this whole passage in a minute or two, but I'm sure it's spread out over the whole evening. And eventually, Jesus mentions to Judas he was going to betray him. And then that just kicks off the whole night. They go to the garden, and there's the betrayal, and then the 5 trials of Jesus, and the torture, and then the crucifixion and its anguish, and the death and the sorrow of his death for all who love Jesus, and then the resurrection and the joy of that for all who loved Jesus. During the Last Supper, they took the Passover, and then they remembered the very first Passover in Egypt, when a lamb was killed and the people of Israel were saved. And then they were brought out from Egypt, redeemed as it were. And like John the Baptist said about Christ, you know, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the whole world." Paul talked about it in Corinthians 2. He said, "Our Passover lamb is Christ, who's already been sacrificed." When we next read about breaking of the bread and keeping the remembrance, it's in the first church. Acts chapter 2, many people came to know Christ, and they're added to the church in Jerusalem. And it says, Acts chapter 2, verse 41, they received the word, they were baptized, they were added unto them. And it says in verse 42, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in breaking of bread and in prayers. They continued steadfastly. They kept going faithfully in the breaking of the bread and prayers. And now you're invited to do the same today. Paul would underline this when he wrote to his friends in Corinth. And he was underlining the importance of and the somberness of the remembrance in Corinthians 11. In Corinthians 11, first he reminds them how Jesus set it up. And he goes over the story that we just read. I've already told you, he says in Corinthians 11, what Jesus did on the night he was betrayed. And it came from the Lord himself. He took some bread in his hands. And after he'd given thanks, he broke it. And he said, this is my body, which is given for you. Eat this and remember me. After the meal, Jesus took a cup of wine in his hands and said, this is my blood. And with it, God makes his new agreement with you. Drink this and remember me. The Lord meant that when you eat this bread and you drink this cup, you tell about his death until he comes. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink from the cup. And I think that's what we're trying to do here in this exercise right now. As we prepare for the remembrance, we're trying to examine ourselves and get in the right headspace for the remembrance. Later, Paul is traveling around. He does this tour of Greece, and it's really cool. He comes to a place called Troas, and it says in Acts 20, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. And how cool it was that Paul, he could travel, and the customs might be different, and the language might be different, and a lot of things might be different, but the remembrance was the same. And it's the way it is now. On a Sunday morning, unless you live in New Zealand, other churches have already done this today before you'll do it. And you'll come and do the remembrance. And unless you live in Victoria, British Columbia, other churches will do it after you this day. But we're blessed to come before God today and be part of this, to be invited in this ceremony that's gone across the world today. We're invited to come and to remember his son and to proclaim his death until he comes. So God bless you as you go to the remembrance today and do that. God bless.